Have you ever noticed how one single image can sometimes just tell a whole story? You know what I mean? Like you see a photo and boom, it just sparks all these questions and intrigue.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Sometimes the smallest details can be the most revealing,
Right.
right?
Exactly. And that's kind of what happened to us when we saw this photo from a meeting in Tokyo. It was between the Japanese prime minister and the foreign ministers of China and South Korea. So pretty high level stuff.
So serious diplomacy going on then.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But what really caught our eye was this. Well, it was almost like an afterthought, like something you could easily miss if you weren't paying close attention. Right there in the background, hanging behind the Japanese prime minister, were these two Chinese characters written in calligraphy.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What were the characters?
Ji Yi. And that's what got us thinking, like, why put those specific characters there, especially in that kind of setting? Given everything going on in the world right now, it felt like there had to be a deeper message there. Like they were trying to tell us something.
It's like a little puzzle, right? A visual clue hinting at the bigger picture. And you know me, I love a good puzzle, especially when it comes to geopolitics.
Well, get ready to put your thinking cap on because we've got a whole stack of puzzle pieces for you today. We've been diving deep into a bunch of different sources, and let me tell you, things are getting interesting. We've got analyses trying to figure out why the Trump administration seems so fixated on getting him to China before April 20th. We've got some wild historical comparisons between the U.S. and, get this, late Ming Dynasty China. We've got the U.S. seemingly changing its stance on a bounty in Afghanistan.
Wait, hold on. The U.S. and the Ming Dynasty. Someone's making that comparison. That's a bold one.
Oh, it's a doozy. We'll get into it, don't worry. We've also got stuff on the U.S. military and what they need strategically, and then there's this whole thing about high-level economic talks between China and Japan suddenly restarting after being basically dead in the water for 6 years.
Yeah.
It's like everyone's making big moves at the same time.
Sounds like we've got a lot to unpack, and they're all seemingly connected.
That's what we're here to figure out. So think of it this way. We've got all these puzzle pieces scattered on the table, right? Some from news articles, some from think tanks, some from historical analyses, all sorts of stuff. And our mission today, if you choose to accept it, is to try and put those pieces together, see if we can make sense of the whole picture. What can these different events tell us about how the US, China, Japan, South Korea, Russia, and even Afghanistan are all interacting right now? It's a real tangled web, that's for sure.
And the real question is, where does Trump's apparent need to get to China fit into all of this?
Exactly. It really feels like his China trip, or at least the idea of it, is a major driving force behind a lot of what we're seeing. So buckle up, folks, because things are about to get fascinating.
Yeah.
And we're going to start by cracking open that calligraphy puzzle. Those two characters, G, they're not just some random decoration. They've got a whole lot of historical baggage.
Okay, so history lesson time. I'm ready. Lay it on me.
All right, so to really understand what Ji means, we got to go back in time, way back, to ancient China. We're talking about Sima Qian, the granddaddy of Chinese historians. You know, the guy who wrote the records of the Grand Historian. A total classic.
Ah, Sima Qian, a legend. I've always admired his work. So much detail, such a fascinating glimpse into ancient China.
Right. A total master. And in his book, he tells the story about Han Xin, who was this brilliant military strategist. This was during the Han Dynasty, one of the most important periods in Chinese history.
Yeah, the Han Dynasty. Talk about empire building. They really set the stage for so much of what we know about Chinese culture and history.
Totally. Anyway, Sima Qian talks about how Han Xin, this amazing general, wasn't always a big shot. In fact, he started out pretty rough. There's this famous anecdote about how he was so poor and desperate that he had to beg for food from some washerwomen down by the river.
Oh, yeah, I remember that story. Not exactly a glamorous start for a future military genius.
Not at all. But then he meets this guy, Liu Bang, who would later become the first emperor of the Han Dynasty. And Liu Bang, he sees something special in Han Xin, even when Han Xin is down on his luck. So he takes Han Xin under his wing, he shares his own clothes and food with him, basically treats him like an equal, even though Han Xin doesn't have much to offer at that point.
Sharing clothes and food, that's a powerful image. It speaks to a real sense of trust and camaraderie, like they're going through tough times together as equals.
Exactly. And that's where the phrase Ji Yi comes from. It's about that shared hardship, that bond forged through tough times. It's about recognizing potential in someone even when they're not at their best. The full idiom, Ji Tuishi, basically means sharing and jointly overcoming difficulties. It's about having each other's backs when things get rough.
Okay, so it's about solidarity, mutual support, facing challenges together. I get it. But what does that have to do with our calligraphy and this meeting in Tokyo?
Well, here's the thing. The Japanese media, they picked up on all this historical context. They pointed out that this calligraphy, the one with G on it, actually belongs to the prime minister's official residence. It's not just some random piece of art they pulled out of storage.
So they chose to display it for this specific meeting, deliberately.
Exactly. And the Japanese media, they interpreted this as a clear signal. They said it shows that Japan is really emphasizing the importance of fostering exchanges and building consensus, especially with China and South Korea. They're basically saying, hey, let's work together. Let's overcome these challenges together.
That's really interesting. So if we're reading between the lines here, it's almost like Japan is subtly positioning itself as a mediator. They're trying to create a more harmonious atmosphere, maybe even pave the way for some kind of breakthrough in Sino-U.S. relations.
That's definitely one way to look at it. And this is where things get even more intriguing because remember, Trump's whole thing about visiting China.
Oh yeah, his big plan to get to China ASAP, within his first 100 days in office, if I remember correctly, which, by the way, puts that deadline right around April 20th. That's not that far off.
Not at all. And based on all the analysis we've been looking at, he seems super determined to make it happen, like maybe even a little too determined. One analysis even went as far as to say that he might be the most eager out of everyone involved in those Russia-Ukraine talks in Riyadh.
Wait, really? More eager than even Putin or Zelensky? That's saying something. What makes them think that?
Well, they argue that for Trump, a successful visit to China is about way more than just, shaking hands and taking photos. It's about proving that he can deliver on his promises, both to his supporters and to the global financial markets. It's about projecting an image of strength and control.
So basically, if he can pull off this China visit, it's a huge win for him on multiple fronts. Domestically, it bolsters his image as a deal-maker who can navigate complex international relations. And internationally, it signals that he's in control of the narrative, that he's calling the shots.
Exactly. And the analysis goes even further, suggesting that getting those U.S.-Russia tensions to cool down a bit is basically a prerequisite for the China trip to even happen.
So it's all connected. He needs to show some progress on the Russia front to create the right conditions for a successful visit to Beijing. That makes a lot of sense strategically. If he just rushes off to China without at least appearing to address the situation in Ukraine, it could look like he's turning his back on a major geopolitical crisis.
Not a good look, especially with that April 20th deadline looming over his head. If he can't deliver on that China visit promise, it could make him look weak and indecisive, like he's not actually in control.
And you know how much he hates looking weak? This guy lives for those power moves, for being the one in charge. So yeah, I can see why that April 20th deadline is adding so much pressure.
Oh, absolutely. And then just to add another layer of crazy to all of this, there's this whole story about Elon Musk and a supposed U.S. combat plan against China. I mean, it sounds like something straight out of a spy movie, right?
Okay, hold on. Elon Musk, as in Tesla and SpaceX Elon Musk. What does he have to do with the U.S. combat plan against China?
I know, right? It's wild. So apparently there were these rumors floating around that Musk had somehow been exposed to this top secret information, like some kind of detailed plan for how the U.S. military would engage with China if things escalated. And the story got picked up by a bunch of media outlets, creating this huge controversy.
So what's the truth here? Was Musk actually privy to this classified information? Did he stumble across something he shouldn't have?
Both Musk and Trump came out swinging, denying the whole thing. They called it a total frame-up, basically implying that someone was deliberately spreading this story to sabotage Trump's efforts to improve relations with China.
That's interesting. So the question becomes, who benefits from spreading this rumor? Who would want to derail a potential thaw in U.S.-China relations?
Right, exactly. And here's where the analysis gets really juicy. They argue that this whole thing might not have actually been about Musk at all. They think the real target might have been Trump himself.
Okay, I'm listening. Explain how that works.
So the theory goes like this. Musk has all these business interests in China, right? Tesla factories, SpaceX ambitions, the whole 9 yards. He's also got a reputation for being, well, let's just say, a little bit unpredictable.
Yeah, unpredictable is one way to put it. The guy definitely marches to the beat of his own drum.
Totally. So the thinking is that if someone could paint Musk as unreliable, as someone who might have been compromised by the Chinese, it would make it much harder for him to play any kind of role in facilitating Trump's China visit. It would basically undermine his credibility as a potential go-between.
I see. So it's all about creating doubt, casting suspicion. If people start questioning Musk's trustworthiness, especially when it comes to sensitive U.S. information, then any attempt by Trump to use him as an unofficial channel to Beijing becomes much riskier. It could even backfire spectacularly.
Exactly. And remember that earlier attempt to use Paulson as a kind of back channel. That didn't really pan out as hoped.
Yeah. Paulson's trip to China was supposed to be a bit under the radar, right? A way to test the waters, maybe lay some groundwork for something bigger down the line. But it doesn't seem to have moved the needle much.
Nope, not really. So this whole Musk thing, it raises the stakes even higher. If even someone with Musk's connections and influence can't be trusted to operate in this space, then who can?
It's almost like Trump is running out of options. He's got this April 20th deadline hanging over him, and he needs to find a way to make this China trip happen. If he can't use traditional diplomatic channels and the back channel attempts are fizzling out, what's left?
Right. And that's why this whole Musk angle is so fascinating. He's like this wild card, this unpredictable element that could either make everything fall into place or blow up in everyone's faces.
It's like a high-stakes poker game, with Trump desperately needing a winning hand. And Musk might be his only ace in the hole, but using that ace could be very risky.
Totally. But it's not just about symbolism and power plays. This whole China visit, it's deeply intertwined with the U.S. economy, like seriously intertwined.
Oh yeah, the money factor always comes into play. How does that fit into the picture?
So the analysis we've been looking at, they make this really interesting argument. They say that for Trump, this China visit is crucial for him to kind of soothe Wall Street's nerves before he might try to pull the trigger on some big-time money printing.
Okay, that's interesting. Money printing, you mean like quantitative easing, trying to stimulate the economy by pumping more dollars into the system.
Exactly. But the thing is, a lot of people are worried that doing that could actually backfire, especially if things with China aren't stable.
Yeah, I can see that. If there's a perception that the U.S. economy is shaky, that the dollar might be losing its value, printing more money could actually make things worse. It could trigger inflation, make investors nervous, even lead to a loss of confidence in the U.S. financial system. Not good.
Definitely not good. And that's where China comes in. Our sources are highlighting this idea that if U.S.-China relations stay rocky, if there's no sense of trust or cooperation, then all those economic anxieties could get amplified big time.
So what they're saying is that Trump needs to show Wall Street that things with China are at least moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
He needs to create a sense of stability, of predictability, to give them the confidence to support his economic policy.
Right. And they point to the specific example, this DeepSeek plus Huawei model that's been getting a lot of attention lately. Apparently, it represents a huge leap forward in Chinese AI and tech capabilities. And for a lot of people in the U.S., that's a major wake-up call.
Oh yeah, the DeepSeek plus Huawei thing, I've been following that. It's a pretty big deal. It's like China is directly challenging the dominance of those big U.S. tech companies, the ones we usually call the Seven Sisters. You know, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, all those guys, the ones who've basically been calling the shots in the global tech world for years.
Exactly. And if China starts eating into their market share, if their profits start taking a hit, well, that could have a ripple effect throughout the entire U.S. economy. And Wall Street knows this. They're watching very closely.
So, the argument is that if Trump can't convince them that he can manage this China situation, that he can prevent things from spiraling out of control, they're going to be a lot less likely to support any kind of risky economic moves, like, say, printing a whole bunch of new money.
It's like he needs to get China on board, at least to some extent, to make his economic plan work. If China keeps surging ahead on the tech front, if they start setting the rules of the game, well, that could shake up the entire global financial system, and that's a scenario that Wall Street definitely wants to avoid.
It makes you wonder if all these anxieties about China, about the economy, are actually what's driving so much of Trump's foreign policy right now.
It really does. And that brings us to, well, this might sound a bit strange, but bear with me. It brings us to late Ming Dynasty China. I know, it sounds like a huge jump, but trust me, there's a connection.
Okay, I'm all ears. I gotta admit, you've got my curiosity piqued with that one.
Yeah.
Ming Dynasty China. I'm not seeing the link just yet.
So remember earlier when I mentioned that Kissinger had made this comparison between the U.S. and late Ming Dynasty China? Apparently, he was talking about how the U.S. might be heading down a dangerous path, kind of like the Ming Dynasty did back in the day.
Okay, that is a pretty bold comparison. Kissinger's not exactly known for making outlandish statements, so that's definitely something to pay attention to. But what exactly is he getting at? What are the parallels he sees?
Our source really breaks this down for us, and it's pretty thought-provoking. They talk about how Kissinger was specifically drawing a comparison to the early Ming dynasty during the reign of Emperor Chengzu, also known as Zhu Dai. You know, the guy who built the Forbidden City and sent Zheng He on those massive voyages across the Indian Ocean.
Ah, Zhang He, the great Chinese explorer. Those voyages were legendary. But what's the connection to the U.S. and Trump?
Well, the source points out that during that time, there was this growing tension between the national team, so to speak, represented by those grand voyages and all the resources they required, and the interests of the wealthy merchants and landowners in the Jiangnan region, which was becoming a real economic powerhouse.
So a clash between state power and private wealth, basically. A classic struggle that we've seen play out throughout history.
Exactly. And the argument is that just like in Ming Dynasty China, where private interests ultimately gained the upper hand and kind of started dictating the national agenda, the same thing could be happening in the U.S. today.
Okay, I'm starting to see the analogy. They're saying that the immense wealth concentrated in the hands of a few individuals and corporations, guys like Elon Musk, could be distorting the U.S.'s priorities, just like it happened back in Ming Dynasty China.
Exactly, and it goes even further. They draw this really stark parallel between how the Ming Dynasty gentry, the wealthy landowners, basically managed to avoid paying taxes, and how figures like Musk have been able to accumulate so much wealth through stock market financing and, well, let's just say creative tax strategies.
So they're arguing that this concentration of wealth, combined with a system that allows some people to avoid contributing their fair share, is weakening the U.S. from within. Just like it happened in Ming Dynasty China, where the state eventually became too reliant on private wealth and lost its ability to effectively govern.
And you know what happened to the Ming Dynasty in the end, right? They were weakened by internal divisions and eventually overthrown by outside forces. The source actually points to a specific event, the Tumu Crisis. Not sure if you're familiar with it.
The Tumu Crisis rings a bell. Wasn't that a major military defeat for the Ming Dynasty? Like a real turning point that exposed how vulnerable they had become.
Exactly. And the argument is that the U.S. today, with all its economic inequality and political polarization, could be heading towards its own Tumu crisis, like some event, maybe a financial crash or a geopolitical miscalculation that suddenly reveals just how fragile the system has become.
Okay, that's a pretty sobering thought. And I can see how that historical analogy would make a lot of people in Washington pretty nervous, especially if they start thinking that their own personal wealth and privilege might be contributing to a larger systemic crisis. Not a comfortable thought for the elites to entertain.
Definitely not. And it makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, this whole push for a China visit is partly motivated by a desire to kind of stave off that potential crisis. Like if Trump can show that he can manage relations with China, that he can get them on board with some kind of economic cooperation, maybe it buys the U.S. some time. Maybe it helps to paper over those cracks in the system.
So a kind of Band-Aid solution to a much deeper problem. It's like they're trying to address the symptoms without really tackling the root cause. And that never ends well, does it?
Not usually. But hey, let's not get too gloomy just yet. Let's switch gears for a bit and talk about Afghanistan. Remember that whole thing about the U.S. canceling the bounty on the Afghan interior minister?
Oh, yeah. The $10 million bounty that the Biden administration put on Sirajuddin Haqqani, the guy who's basically running the show in Afghanistan now, that was a pretty big deal at the time. And now Trump is just wiping it away.
It seems that way, yeah. And the timing is really interesting, right in the middle of all this other stuff going on with China and Russia. So what's the deal with that? What's the strategic thinking behind this sudden change of heart?
The source interprets this move as a signal, a very deliberate signal directed at Russia.
A signal about what, exactly?
It suggests that the U.S. might be signaling a willingness to kind of re-engage with the Taliban, to start talking again, to maybe even explore some kind of cooperation on certain issues.
Interesting. But wouldn't that basically be admitting that the Biden administration's withdrawal was a mistake? Like that they were wrong to just pull out of Afghanistan and leave a power vacuum for the Taliban to fill?
It would definitely look that way, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And politically, that's a tough pill for a lot of people in Washington to swallow.
For sure. But the source argues that this move might actually be less about Afghanistan itself and more about using it as a lever to influence relations with Russia and China.
Okay, I can see that. So how does that play out? What's the end game here?
Well, they point out that re-engaging with the Taliban is something that would generally benefit China. They've got their own strategic interests in Afghanistan, access to resources, securing their borders, that kind of thing.
Yeah, China's been playing the long game in Afghanistan for a while now, building relationships, investing in infrastructure, trying to position themselves as a reliable partner in the region. And that's all been made a lot easier since the U.S. pulled out.
Right. So the source argues that by canceling this bounty and suggesting a potential shift in U.S. policy towards the Taliban, Trump is basically trying to do a couple of things at once.
Lay it on me.
First, they say he's trying to create a wedge between China and Russia. Like, if the U.S. starts cozying up to the Taliban, it could make Russia nervous. They've got their own security concerns in Central Asia, and they don't want to see the Taliban becoming too powerful.
So a classic divide and conquer strategy.
Right.
Create a bit of tension between two rivals and then exploit that to your advantage.
It's a tactic that's as old as time. But the source also points out that there's another, perhaps even more important, objective at play here.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the other objective?
It all comes back to that China visit. They argue that by signaling this potential shift in U.S. policy towards Afghanistan, Trump is trying to smooth the way for his trip to Beijing.
Ah, so it's all about creating a more receptive atmosphere, showing that he's willing to make concessions to find common ground, even if it means contradicting his own administration's previous stance.
Exactly. He's basically saying to China, hey, look, I'm willing to play ball. I'm willing to do things your way, at least on this issue. So how about we have a nice chat, maybe work out a deal?
It's a bold move, that's for sure. But it's also pretty risky. If he doesn't get something concrete out of that China visit, if it just ends up being a symbolic photo op,
Yeah.
it could backfire spectacularly. He could end up looking weak and indecisive, like he's giving away leverage for nothing.
Oh, he's definitely walking a tightrope. And it's not just on the diplomatic front either. This need for a less tense relationship with China, it's even impacting the U.S. military.
Wait, really? How so?
So the analysis we've been looking at, they point out that the U.S. military is facing some serious budgetary constraints. They've got all these commitments around the world, and it's getting harder and harder to stretch their resources.
Yeah, the Pentagon's budget is always a hot topic in Washington. Lots of competing priorities, lots of pressure to keep spending under control,
Yeah.
especially with all the other domestic issues that need funding.
Exactly. And the source argues that this is making it really difficult for the U.S. military to carry out certain strategic maneuvers, particularly when it comes to redeploying forces from one region to another.
Okay, so they need more flexibility, more room to maneuver. What's the specific example they're using to illustrate this?
They talk about the possibility of needing to move an aircraft carrier from the Western Pacific to the Middle East. Apparently, there's growing concern about Iran, especially after that recent earthquake near Natanz and all the rumors swirling around about their nuclear program.
The Natanz earthquake. That definitely raised some eyebrows. And then you've got Netanyahu back in power in Israel, and he's never been shy about pushing for a more aggressive stance against Iran, the Greater Israel, as he likes to call it. So I can see why the U.S. military might be feeling the need to beef up its presence in the region.
Right, and it's not just Iran. The whole situation in the Middle East is just a powder keg, right? So the analysis argues that to respond effectively to any potential crisis, the U.S. military needs to be able to quickly shift its forces to where they're needed most.
Which means they need to be able to reduce their commitments in other regions without creating a vulnerability.
Exactly, and that's where China comes in.
So they're saying that the U.S. can't really afford to pull a major asset like an aircraft carrier out of the Western Pacific if tensions with China remain high.
It's a huge risk. If they move the carrier out and then something happens, some kind of confrontation or provocation, well, it could put the U.S. in a really tough spot. They'd be caught flat-footed without the necessary firepower to respond effectively.
So what they're saying is that easing tensions with China, at least to some extent, is becoming a necessity for the U.S. military to be able to do its job properly.
That seems to be the takeaway, yeah. They need that flexibility, that freedom of movement, and right now the China situation is a major obstacle to achieving that.
It's like a giant game of chess, with all these different pieces moving around the board, each with its own objectives and constraints. And sometimes, the most unexpected moves can have the biggest impact on the overall game.
It really is. And speaking of unexpected moves, let's talk about Japan and South Korea for a minute. They're two of the U.S.'s closest allies in the region, but even they seem to be making their own calculations about how to navigate this whole China situation.
Oh yeah, they're definitely not just blindly following Washington's lead anymore. They've got their own interests to protect. What's the specific example that's got you thinking about this?
Well, the fact that the China-Japan high-level economic dialogue has suddenly restarted after 6 years of being basically frozen, that seems like a pretty big deal, especially considering that it apparently stalled during Trump's first term.
It's a huge development.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's happening now during Trump's second term and seemingly without any strong objections from Washington suggests that something has shifted. Like maybe Japan isn't quite as aligned with the U.S. as it used to be.
And our source even goes as far as to say that this could be seen as a slap in the face to Trump, highlighting how much Japan's priorities might have diverged from those of the US. It's like they're saying, hey, we're going to do what's best for us, even if it means going against what you want.
It's a build move, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder what's going on behind the scenes. Like what kind of conversations are they having with China? What kind of deals are they making?
Right. And then you connect this back to that calligraphy, the GE characters that were so prominently displayed during the meeting with the Chinese and South Korean foreign ministers. It almost feels like Japan was sending a message, not just to China, but to the US as well. Like they're saying, look, we're all in this together. We need to find a way to cooperate to overcome these challenges together.
It's like they're trying to create a more multilateral approach to regional stability, one where they're not just taking orders from Washington, but actively shaping the agenda.
Exactly. And it's not just Japan either. South Korea is also showing signs of wanting to re-engage economically with China. They've even expressed interest in restarting talks about a free trade agreement.
So even with all the talk about a new Cold War and this intensifying rivalry between the U.S. and China, it seems like some of the key players in the region aren't quite ready to choose sides. They're hedging their bets, keeping their options open.
Totally. And it's not just about economics either. There's also a lot of domestic political stuff happening in South Korea that's adding another layer of complexity to all of this.
Yeah.
Remember that whole impeachment saga with President Yoon Suk-yeol?
Oh, yeah, that was a wild ride. And it's still not over, right? The final verdict was postponed again, pushed back to sometime in April. And then you've got Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. He was just acquitted on corruption charges.
And the source suggests that this whole situation might actually be being used as leverage by the Trump administration.
Leverage for what? What are they trying to achieve?
Well, they argue that the timing of these events, happening right around the same time as Trump's potential China visit, isn't just a coincidence. They think the Trump administration might be sending some subtle messages to South Korea, maybe even some veiled warnings.
Like, hey, you better cooperate with us on this China thing, or else things could get a lot more complicated for you back home.
Something like that, yeah. It's all very cloak and dagger, very much in the realm of speculation. But the source makes a compelling case that there's more going on here than meets the eye. Like, maybe the Trump administration is using these domestic political developments in South Korea to influence their stance on the China visit.
It would definitely fit with Trump's style, wouldn't it? Always playing hardball, always looking for an angle. And if he can get South Korea to publicly support his China diplomacy, it would be a huge win for him. It would show that even with all the tensions and rivalries, the U.S. still has strong allies in the region.
It would make his China trip look even more like a success. Like he's bringing everyone together, building consensus, strengthening alliances, all the things he needs to project an image of strength and leadership.
Exactly. It's all about the optics, about controlling the narrative. And if he can pull it off, it could really shift the momentum in his favor.
So as we piece all of this together, what we're seeing is a really fascinating, if somewhat unsettling, picture of just how complex and interconnected the world really is. You've got Trump, driven by this intense personal and political need to make that China visit happen before mid-April. He's got domestic economic anxieties to address, an image of global leadership to maintain, and a whole bunch of international pressures to navigate.
And all of that is playing out against a backdrop of, well, let's just say less than ideal circumstances. You've got strategic maneuvering in Afghanistan, the U.S. military needing more flexibility to operate effectively, and even key U.S. allies like Japan and South Korea seemingly making their own calculations about how to engage with China, potentially even if it means diverging slightly from Washington's preferred path.
And at the center of it all, you have that seemingly innocuous piece of calligraphy, those two characters, G. It's almost like a visual metaphor for the entire situation, isn't it? This idea of shared challenges, of needing to find common ground, of overcoming obstacles together.
It's a powerful image, and it raises a really crucial question for all of us to consider. Beyond all the public statements and the diplomatic maneuvering, what are the true underlying strategic goals of each nation involved in this complex dance? What are they really hoping to achieve? What are their long-term visions for the future?
And perhaps even more importantly, how might the outcome of Trump's potential China visit, whether it happens before that April 20th deadline or not, genuinely reshape the global landscape? Will it be a turning point towards greater cooperation and stability, or will it simply exacerbate the existing tensions and rivalries?
Those are the big questions, aren't they? And I think the answers are going to be a lot more nuanced and multifaceted than any of the headlines would suggest. We're dealing with a level of complexity here that goes far beyond simple explanations or easy predictions.
It's like we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world of unspoken agreements and hidden motivations lurking beneath the surface. And those are the things that are going to determine the real course of events, the things that are going to shape the future of international relations in the years to come.
So if you're listening to this, pay close attention. Don't just accept the surface-level narratives. Dig deeper, ask questions, and most importantly, stay curious. Because the world is a lot more complicated and a lot more fascinating.